Okay, so welcome everyone to our event. We are going to wait 1 minute or so to allow everyone to enter through the link before we start the formal welcomings and presentation of speakers. Right, so I can see the numbers going up. So let's make a start. So welcome everyone to the Women's Budget Group and the Women's Environmental Network discussion on what a feminist Green New Deal could look like in the UK. And so today we are discussing a paper on the beginnings of a feminist Green New Deal. And to give you a bit of context on this paper, so this paper was a submission to the Women's Budget Group Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. And this commission is due to report in September. And we are launching the paper today with WEN as a discussion paper. So we're hoping also that this is the first step in a longer project that we are starting with WEN, in which we aim to produce a fleshed out feminist Green New Deal with principles and concrete policy proposals in collaboration with other environmental organizations, economic think tanks, and also with the women's sector. And so our goal with this project and this first paper is to influence the conversations on Build Back Better and Green New Deal plans to make sure that any future plans for a sustainable and carbon neutral economy will also have a gender equality at the center. And so our event today is going to be 1 hour long. We will have 40 minutes for a presentation of the paper by the authors, in which me and Halima will take turns in asking some questions to the authors. And we will also have some time at the end for questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions throughout the event, just write them in the chat. My colleague Jenna will be monitoring it and sending us a few for discussion at the end, depending on how much time we have. I also encourage people to make use of the chat, so introduce yourselves in the chat, and we will also be posting links to the discussion paper and a summary we did in the chat throughout the event, so look out for those. And please, we ask you to be respectful and civil in the chat. We will take a very strong line of expelling from the event anyone who posts abusive comments or is disrespectful in any way. So please, yeah, be civil. And just to inform you that the event is being recorded and a video recording will be available on our website shortly after we end the event. And we are also live tweeting the event under hashtag FEM Green New Deal. So if you want to join the discussion on Twitter, please join at the hashtag. So I'll continue by presenting the speakers. So my co-chair today is Dr. Halima Begum from WEN. So Halima is the chair of the Women's Environmental Network, and she's also a trustee of Toynbee Hall. Halima's 23-year career has been built in senior roles, supporting the UK commitment to global development, predominantly with DFID and then the British Council as well. And most recently, she was with the LEGO Foundation as VP for Global Programs. We also have one of the authors of the paper, Dr. Sherilyn MacGregor from the University of Manchester. So she's an academic at Manchester whose research focuses on the relationship between feminist and environmental politics. Sherilyn advocates an intersectional ecofeminism for the 99% and explores what a just future could look like in the face of climate emergency. And we have also Maeve Cohen, the other author of the paper. She's director of Rethinking Economics and is currently studying for a master's in political economy at the University of Manchester. Maeve was a co-founder of the Post-Crash Economic Society at the University of Manchester, and the Post-Crash Economic Society went on to become one of the founding groups of Rethinking Economics, which is an international student-led campaign to reform economics education. And I'm Sara Reis, the head of research and policy at the Women's Budget Group. So we are going to begin the discussion, and I will hand it over to Halima to ask the first question to the authors.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone else. And God, what a great way to start the day, or at least my lunchtime. I'm sitting here in Denmark. So we're going to start off with an easy question, although easy questions always hide complexity, I think. So what are we talking about when we talk about the Green New Deal?
Hi, it's really great to be here. Just to clarify, I am not actually director at Rethinking Economics. I'm a former director. I can't do that and a master's at once. I'm only one woman. But yeah, I was just going to say very quickly on this, because I imagine that most people have a pretty good idea of what the Green New Deal is. So the Green New Deal was devised in the last financial crisis in the UK, and it was aiming to address the triple crisis of the finance crisis, the environmental crisis, and the crisis in social and economic inequality. And the way that it intended to do this is to invest heavily in the greening the economy, thus creating jobs that could address social and economic inequality and the recession, whilst also decarbonising the economy to address the environmental crisis. So Sherilyn and I looked at lots of the proposals for a Green New Deal, and there were some themes that ran throughout them. So I'll just briefly summarise them now. So firstly was obviously decarbonising the economy, and that took the form of decarbonising highly polluting industries such as transport, energy and construction mainly. And they also all talked about democratising the economy, and that meant championing new forms of ownerships like cooperatives, community-led firms, municipal firms, and things like that. They also championed devolution back to the regions and a rebalancing of power between the private and public sectors. They all were talking about a socially just transition. So that was the part addressing economic inequality through new job creation in these green industries. As well as an increase in access through better transport links, as well as training and development opportunities. They also talk about preserving the natural environment. So that's things like reforesting, rewilding, banning single-use plastics and things like that. They all talk about a reform of finance and banking, as well as tax reform. So banking reform and things like green investment banks and regional banks, as well as increased public borrowing. And they all took very seriously our international responsibilities. So they recognised that countries in the global north are responsible for high carbon emissions, and countries in the global south disproportionately feel the negative effects of high carbon emissions. So they recognised this and championed a multilateral internationalism, which meant finance, resource and technology transfers from global north to global south. And finally, just one thing about them is that they are all expert-led. So it is think tanks and political parties and policy people that have developed these, though some do recognise the need for them to become more people-led. And that about summarises what me and Sherilyn were talking about when we talk about a Green New Deal.
Thank you very much for outlining what is common to the new Green Deal. And I think that's also a nice segue into our next question as to what they don't have in common and what's left out, really. So Sarah, I'm going to pass the baton over to you for the next question.
Thank you, Halima. So yes, that's precisely what the next question will be. So how can we transform a Green New Deal into a feminist Green New Deal? So basically, what makes a Green New Deal feminist?
I'm going to answer that one. Hi, everyone. So I think the way we approach writing the paper is to think first about what would make it feminist. What are the essential ingredients? of a feminist Green New Deal. And I just summarized three really. And first is intersectionality is central to our feminist approach. And of course, it's central to the work of the Women's Environmental Network, as well as the Women's Budget Group, and many other feminist organizations that are working on thinking about what a Green New Deal might be. And intersectionality is not just an academic buzzword, it's a really important political concept in the struggle for social justice, for understanding the multiple axes of social difference that shape people's access to power and resources, including gender, but also race, class, national origin, citizenship status, disability, sexuality, and so on. Intersectionality is a tool for being able to address how people are affected differently, for example, by climate emergency, because of systemic exclusion and exploitation. And it really points out how ridiculous it is that the interests of a whole society tend to be defined around a very narrow set of life patterns and experiences of sort of well-off, able-bodied, straight white men and women. So plans for a feminist Green New Deal would require intersectional gender analysis across all policies and actions. And I hope we've made that clear in the paper. The second essential ingredient is an analysis of the deep connections between gender equality and environmental destruction. And I think what we've tried to do is to bring to this paper important insights from a body of research that has always tried to integrate feminism and environmentalism. In the paper, we've called it feminist ecological economics, but we draw on broader thinking in ecofeminist political economy and ecofeminism more generally. And this is a body of thinking that has been arguing since the 1990s that there's an underlying logic that underpins capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy that creates interlocking problems of gender-based inequalities and violence and ecological destruction. This work has come from scholars and activists in many different countries in global North and global South. Scholars like Mary Meller, Silvia Federici, Vandana Shiva, just to name a few. And that work is really important in trying to analyze in a kind of systematic and rigorous way a logic of domination that underpins our systems, a violent logic of control, extraction, and disposal that leads to interlocking crises that we face today, including a crisis of climate change and climate emergency, as well as a crisis of care. So essential to a feminist Green New Deal is this understanding of root causes that need to be tackled together in an interlocking way. The third central feminist insight is that the gender division of labor and the unequal division of care, the feminization of care, where women do the most unpaid caring labor and paid caring labor, is a driver of gender equality. It's a driver of material, cultural, and political inequality. And the Women's Budget Group has, as you know, produced a wealth of research to support this and evidence this point. So we would argue that the work of social reproduction, so generally speaking, labor like housework, raising children, elder care, and so forth, which is almost always underpaid, undervalued, and invisibilized in economic and social policies, really needs to be considered in whatever we're talking about in terms of building a low carbon, community-based economy that we might want to call green. So a feminist Green New Deal would aim to do just that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn, for that comprehensive question, which also segues really well into our next one, which Halima will ask.
Yeah, so I think you've touched on the unequal division of care work, both paid and unpaid, between women and men, and that being a very big driver for gender inequality. And so I just want to home in on that, if that's okay. Could you tell us a little bit more on why the even distribution of care work is also good for the environment, why it's to the core of a sort of climate agenda? So I think we're all aware of the unequal division of labor between women and men, but why is that so central to taking care of our planet and our environment?
Well, this is where I want to bring in the 3 R's. And this is not the environmentalists' well-worn 3 R's of reduce, reuse, and recycle, or the original New Deal, FDR's original New Deal from the 1930s, where it was about relief, recovery, and reform. But really, this is the really important sort of feminist piece to this, which is that in order to close the gender gap, we need to recognize, redistribute, and reduce care work. And this is the 3 R's that we've used in the paper, and we can attribute it to Diane Elson, the feminist economist, who's also part of the Women's Budget Group. And we think that we really want to get across to people that all 3 of these 3 R's are good for people and also good for the environment. So what do I mean by that, right? Recognizing and valuing care more, recognizing care by giving it better pay and conditions, maybe even a carer's income, as being proposed by the Global Women's Strike and the Women of Color Global Women's Strike. By doing this, it might mean that more people, especially men, might want to do it. Might want to go into jobs and employment that are in the caring and service sectors. And I think we're going to come on to a question about employment shortly. But I want to focus on also the benefits. So not only about revaluing and recognizing care, but redistributing care more fairly and reducing the amount of time people, i.e. women, spend, as well as spend doing care, as well as reducing the negative aspects of care. Of course, care is also a very positive part of our lives, and sort of feminists we often focus on, being concerned about how it's kind of negative for us, but there's also positive aspects. But I think the thing that we wanted to point out is that care work is very time consuming. And the more that people have to juggle it with paid work, the less likely they have time to participate in collective public life. And we know from public opinion data that women and people of color are more likely to have pro-environmental concerns and support pro-environmental policies than white men. And that the more women there are in politics, active in political life, the better a country or a community performs on climate and other environmental targets. So alleviating women's double day of paid and unpaid work not only goes some way towards closing the gender gap, but it also has significant environmental political benefits. In terms of thinking about paid care work and reducing the negatives there, this could mean moving away from the kinds of aspects of paid care work that are quite negative to bodies and to the environment. So for example, chemical intensive cleaning and care work. So we know that chemicals have a very negative effect on people who are doing a lot of cleaning and maintenance work, and as well on the environment itself. There should also be better ways to deliver care without excessive, say, car travel. So we could think about free public transportation for care workers. And there's also some really interesting work on aging in place, or creating age-friendly communities where it would be easier as well as less resource intensive to provide care for older people. And this would become even more important as we have an aging society. We could also look at how to redistribute and reduce unpaid care work in households and in everyday life. Environmentalists are very keen to retrofit and build sort of new houses that are super energy efficient and have lots of green gadgets and green technologies. And that's of course very necessary. However, this is also a really good opportunity to think about the design of these houses. These houses might be really nice and warm and have lower bills and lower CO2 emissions, but they will very likely not be designed from the perspective of the user, so the person or the people who do the care work every day. So, how might we think about making it easier for them to live more sustainably, in less resource intensive and wasteful ways? For example, even new build flats and houses are being designed with no space for 5 different recycling bins, no space for drying laundry, no space for storing a bike with a child carrier or a wheelchair, no space for children to play where they can be overlooked and watched by an adult who might actually be multitasking or working from home. No spaces for collectivizing cooking or doing childcare, sharing tools and toys with neighbors. So we know that living communally and cooperatively is better, not just for the environment in terms of resource use, but also better for people organizing and collectivizing care. And I don't, there's probably many more examples than the ones I've just said that people listening right now or tuning in right now could add. And I really don't want these points to be dismissed as sort of like Western middle class, lifestyles, green lifestyles, because research shows that there are so many important links and synergies between sort of low carbon living and high welfare living. For example, older women have been looking to co-housing for both social and ecological reasons. My research recently in Manchester with Somali residents found that many women would much rather be able to share things like cooking, do things in groups at home with other women, the way they used to do at home when back in Somalia. Again, and these are for social reasons as well as the desire to live more lightly on the earth, which for them is central to their faith. So this is a kind of critique that we have of a lot of the green thinking, is that they put a lot of effort into changing energy technology and changing individual behaviors, but not spending enough time thinking about how to change the physical infrastructure to design environments that enable a reduction or redistribution of caring labor. I've yet to see a Green New Deal discussion of housing that goes beyond energy efficiency.
Thank you, Sherilyn. We're going to come back to this issue of design process in a moment, but just before we move on, I wanted to ask Maeve, so this question about uneven labor and that distinction between paid and unpaid, I guess from your perspective in a post-crash economy, what does that question feel like? Because presumably the distinction between paid and unpaid in a post-crash economy is quite blurred. So how would you answer that question? Why is the unequal division of care work so important in a post-crash economy, for example?
I think it's pretty blurred in this economy, let alone a post-crash economy. Yeah, I think that basically the division of paid and unpaid care work is the driving force behind gender inequality, or one of the main driving forces behind gender inequality. So if you crack that nut, if we're able to have an equal distribution of paid and unpaid care work, that will go a long way towards addressing a lot of the other issues of gender inequality. Yeah. Yeah,
no, great. And so I'm sort of loving the intersectionality that's coming out from your answers, and I'm going to park some of my questions for now because I think there are some good employment questions that Sara wants to home in on.
Yeah, so obviously one of the big things or themes of Green New Deal plans are on the future of employment. So what would employment look like in a sustainable and low carbon economy? So what we want to focus now is on what will be the key focus of a feminist Green New Deal on employment and the future of employment. So what does employment look like in a feminist sustainable future?
Yeah, well, I think first of all we need to make it easier for women to enter the workforce in the first place. So obviously that means reducing the burden of unpaid care work. And that means investing heavily in the caring industry. And I think we need to be really careful about, well, really targeted about how we communicate this. Like, care jobs are green jobs. If we want to create a just society and a just green society, we need to not just be focusing on reducing carbon emissions in the high polluting industries. We need to be investing in and raising up the already low carbon caring industries. And I think we all know that the caring industries have been pushed so far down the political agenda forever that as green tech and conversations about greening the economy become more and more important and higher up the political agenda, by framing care jobs as green jobs, as we should, as they are, will hopefully change the prestige around caring work and make it so that policymakers are thinking about it more seriously, and also make it so it's a more attractive industry. Like Sherilyn says, obviously hand in hand with adequate wages and progression opportunities, make it an attractive industry for both men and women. So step one would be a properly funded caring industries with a gender balanced workforce. The other aspect that the Green New Deals talk about a lot is opening up, obviously, these huge new avenues of employment. And this is this highly skilled, high paid job in the areas that we discussed: construction, transport, technology, energy. All of these industries are massively underrepresented by women and by people of colour and by people with other social vulnerabilities. For example, only 17% of tech jobs are held by women at the minute. So we need to be trying to change this underrepresentation through bursaries, through training opportunities, through paid educational leave, and other financial and non-financial incentives. So basically, step number 2 would be these thriving green tech, green construction, green energy industries, again, with a gender balanced workforce. And just to build on some of the things that Sherilyn was saying, a lot of these like green policies are thought of without much heed to what the social aspects are. So for example, food, right? So food accounts for 26% of global carbon emissions. So that sector desperately needs reforming. And all of the Green New Deals talk about bringing food in locally, producing local organic food, which is great, and we are totally behind that. But if we're all having like locally grown, unprocessed food, there's going to be a lot more labour involved in processing that food and making meals. And typically that labour will fall on the shoulders of women. But it's also the opportunity to open up a huge new sector, right? Or at least build on a sector. We can create jobs of people who do that work, right? So we can have jobs for people who are processing this food and cooking this food and delivering it to our houses. So we've got these sustainable workplaces, and we've got delicious locally grown food and low carbon emissions, which is brilliant. Also, very quickly on nappies as well, a ban on single-use plastic means a ban on disposable nappies. That's a nightmare, right? That increases the labour of childcare massively. But we can have local laundries. Instead of us boiling it on the hob, we can have local laundries where people can come and take that and do that work for us. We also need to think about automation. I think there's this framing around automation as this tide of automation that's going to come and sweep us all up and we're all going to lose our jobs. We're in control of automation. It's just human-led, so we can control it. So we need to have a managed and inclusive process around automation and what jobs get automated and what jobs we value. And we need to be making sure these new jobs in the tech sector are accessible to women. But we also need to make sure that the productivity gains that we get from automation are evenly distributed. And that means short working weeks, and that means higher wages. It's also really important that the voices of women and other underrepresented groups are heard in economic decision making and design. And that doesn't just mean more female CEOs, right? So it means completely restructuring how we participate in our economies. And like the proposals for the Green New Deal say, this means developing and scaling up different forms of ownership, rebalancing that power between the public and the private sectors. And it means that people involved in these cooperatives and community-led organisations and municipally-led firms are then part of creating and designing and guiding their own local economy. So I'm like a really big fan of community wealth building, which is all about local procurement, working with big institutions. So instead of getting Serco to do their laundry and take those profits out of the area, get a local laundry to do it, and you create and retain wealth within your local community. I think things like that are going to be really important. But this inclusive economic democracy really needs to go hand in hand with provision of necessary support. So it's that thing, we can't just invite people to the party, we need to invite people to the party and ask them to dance, right? So if we're going to have like a participatory budgeting meeting, we need to make sure it's at a time of day that everybody can attend. There needs to be childcare provision if that's necessary. There needs to be accessible, there need to be hearing loops and things like that, so that everybody in the community can attend, and that needs to be properly considered and carried out.
Thank you, Maeve. So you've sort of brought up a lot of questions around design of process and what's the best form of design that's inclusive and participatory. So my next question really is about the process of designing a feminist Green New Deal. And here I'm really interested also in hearing about how we include the participation of groups that otherwise are quite marginalized, wherever they may be. And I guess at the back of my mind, I'm thinking the climate sector and the environment sector is particularly white, male and stale and middle class. So if we were designing for a feminist new Green Deal, how would we do it? Where would we start?
Well, I think this is a really, really important question. And when we started working on this paper, in addition to reviewing the existing plans in the UK, we looked for examples of other feminist Green New Deals or other kind of Green New Deals that are offering an alternative or a counter narrative to the sort of mainstream green economics focused Green New Deals. And we found some interesting examples, mostly from North America, with the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal based in the US, and the LEAP Manifesto in Canada. And both of these have come from grassroots mobilizations with a very wide range of groups participating, from Indigenous groups, labor unions, feminist groups, teachers, artists, immigrant rights organizations, and environmentalists. And this is really sort of intersectionality in action, where people come together across their very, interconnecting, but sometimes wide differences to try and talk about what kind of future do we want. And so far in the UK, we don't think there has been enough of this grassroots engagement. I think there's a lot of scope for this, but I think we really need to prioritize opening up spaces and opening up dialogue for more voices to shape the environmental agenda. And I think sort of one example that I think is worth flagging in the UK is the work that a coalition of groups called Wretched of the Earth have written, and they wrote a really powerful letter to Extinction Rebellion to try to make the point that you can have a green society that is still very patriarchal and racist and homophobic and ableist and ageist, and that there's actually quite a danger of some of the environmental arguments around a climate emergency that sort of backgrounds some of these, what often gets dismissed as identity politics. So when we look at the UK right now, as Maeve said, this is largely a conversation within think tanks and policy circles. It doesn't seem to be participatory enough, although this might be changing. I think we've just called in the paper for design processes, participatory town planning, all the things that feminists actually have been arguing for decades. So this could be, this can be changing the culture of design professions and so forth, and the education of designers and planners. But I think the place to start really is to have more deliberative opportunities, experiments, mini publics, citizens assemblies, and so forth that bring a wide diversity of people into the conversation. I would like to say it's important to note that this paper has tried to model some of that, because when we wrote the draft, we presented it to an audience in March at the WEN Forum in Manchester, where we invited, so I think there was 150 people who came along to listen to our our draft recommendations and to comment on it. We also had the important contributions of panelists that we that were part of that evening, and I want to acknowledge their input. So Guppy Bulla from workingonourpower.org, Tina Rothery from the Nanas, Zarina Ahmed from Semvo Scotland, and Emma Greenwood, who's a youth climate activist. And they all provided really important input from their different perspectives. And I think we really need to have more events and debates like that. And ideally, that people from the think tanks would come along to listen, because it's at the local level where a wider diversity of people's lives can be represented, and what would make a Green New Deal more resonant and more about them. And actually, I just want to say one last thing before we move on, is that the LEAP manifesto example, and we actually discussed that a little bit at the event in March, is that the LEAP manifesto, this, by the way, which was kind of organized by Naomi Klein, but involved a lot of key kind of leaders in Canada. But when people came along to discuss what a post-carbon future would look like, what a socially just transition to a post-carbon future would look like, they came up with was the kind of idea of caring for each other and the earth. Care was at the center. Carbon was not at the center, but care was. And I think it's so important that we sort of, as feminists, really push the fact that care has such political power. It gets marginalized and sort of dismissed as sort of something that we feel, but it's work, and it's also a politically relevant concept that should go to the center and to the heart of democracy. Yeah.
So in the paper, which I have read in a lot of detail, I think where you bring out the pillar around transforming social structures is where you can get that bottom-up building of greater participation of local communities, whether that's BAME groups, whether that's other groups about power. So I think, to your point about looking at other forms of social practices from Somali communities, for example, and collectively organizing around food. So I think that was actually one of the more powerful parts of the paper, where we're not just talking about the physical infrastructure or the tech or the way in which fuel is generated. It's more about changing the norms and behaviors of how we value care, and looking at particular communities that haven't already been represented in these discourses. We might learn a lot more from them. But Maeve, I'm just sort of looking at you before we go on to our final question. Do you have any thoughts around the process of designing Feminist Green New Deal and capturing in the voices of those who have less power?
I think I agree with everything that Sherilyn said. I think that we had a really interesting discussion the other day about how in the New Deal, like the social contract was, you do all of this stuff and what you're going to get is consumer goods, right? You're going to get cars and you're going to get nice houses. And just like you were talking to them, we need to change like the social priorities. And I think we need to change, obviously that can't be the incentive for a Green New Deal. We need to be reducing how much we're consuming. So I think that we need to have a new social contract around this, which is based around care and based around the fact that if you are involved in this new economy, what you're going to get is richer relationships with your family and your loved ones. We're going to have better technology to communicate people with better. We're going to have public spaces where we can engage with each other and enjoy our communities better. And I think care is at the centre of that. And selling the Green New Deal not on consumption but on a more caring and an idea of human flourishing is a big part of that.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Sara now.
Yes, so I'm conscious of the limited time that we have remaining. So I guess we will, if that's okay, Halima, I think we will do the final two questions into one, and then Sherilyn and Maeve can sort of wrap up before we go into the taking questions from the audience. So basically the final questions would be, what are the three key recommendations that for a Feminist Green New Deal So what should any Green New Deal plan include to ensure that it serves everyone? But also, and I think they are interlinked. So what or how does the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that we are living now change any of the things that you discuss in the paper? Does it change anything at all, or does it make some of them more urgent, or any aspects of the plan more urgent, which have been brought to stark relief?
I'll just sum up. If you said what are the 3 key recommendations, and obviously the paper has a lot more than 3, but maybe the 3 I was going to say take home messages, but since most people are probably home, I'll say the 3 takeaway messages are 1, to start thinking about care jobs as green jobs. We don't want caring as usual in a just transition or a just recovery. 2, we need to integrate our changes so that the social and physical infrastructure can achieve a sustainable society at the same time as put an end to caring as usual, i.e. recognize, redistribute, and reduce unpaid care and domestic work. This means we need to stop focusing on just thinking that a Green New Deal is about tech and behavioral change. It's much deeper than that. There's many win-win situations in how we can have a more egalitarian society at the same time as reducing human impact on the planet. And the third is that we need more inclusive, we need the Green New Deal to be a much more inclusive and democratic process. We need to get the discussion out of the think tanks and into the community centers, youth clubs and village halls, mosques and synagogues and churches, and many socially distanced forms of participation too. And really that we want this to be, our paper to be the opening of a conversation. It's not a blueprint. Maeve, do you want to tackle the other one about what pandemic? So now, because we started writing this in sort of end of January, before we really recognized that this pandemic was really going to hit us and it was going to change a lot of things. And we've had a few discussions since, haven't we, Maeve, about whether if we just start over and write now, whether it would be different. And I'll let you sort of talk a little bit about how we've been thinking about this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we feel like COVID has made this both more urgent, but also a lot more realistic. The crisis has really shone a light on how important the caring and services sectors are. And I think a lot more people are recognizing how grossly underfunded and undervalued they have been for absolutely ever. And I think the work of environmental campaigners has done an incredible job of bringing the conversation about the environment front and center in these political discussions. And I think what COVID has done is made a lot more people basically get it with the environment, right? They get that our economic system is dependent on exploitation of nature and it's unsustainable and we need to change how we produce and consume things. People get that or some version of that by and large. And I think what this crisis has done is show that the same is true of the exploitation of caring labour, though I don't think many people would call it the exploitation of caring labour, but yeah, you get what I mean. We recognise that this like undervalued workforce, often called unskilled workforce, is essential. It's what society runs on, right? So now is really the time to be pushing for policies that address both the ecological crisis, but also the crisis in care. And we as feminists need to be at the front of that march of making that point. And I think that we need to be making that point to people outside our movement, but also like people within it. And not to name names, I absolutely love Ed Miliband, but Ed Miliband wrote a piece for The Observer on Sunday where he talked about how he said it's obvious that we need a new deal for health workers, but we also need a Green New Deal. And this is quite a typical theme of the mainstream narrative, that care is separate to the green economy. And I really cannot make this point enough. Care jobs are green jobs, right? So me and Sherilyn wrote a blog today that's out in Open Democracy where we talk about a rainbow recovery. And the idea is that we can't have this narrow definition of a green recovery. We can't just paint it purple and call it a feminist recovery. we've got to have a rainbow recovery that includes all of these different factors that we've been discussing throughout the last hour, and make sure that everybody is brought along in recovery that we create. We need to be super careful about how we do this, and we need to be really, really clear in saying COVID-19 is not an opportunity. It is an absolute disaster. It is causing untold human suffering, and it is an awful, awful thing. Like, it's fair enough we can say, like, this air pollution's gone down, CO2 emissions have gone down. That's fine, and we can hope that this causes a change in public consciousness. But there's a real minority of people that are pushing this narrative that, like, COVID is wiping out humans and saving nature, right? That, like, we are the virus and coronavirus is nature's cure. And it's a really dangerous eco-fascist narrative, and it is particularly dangerous for women. It's dangerous for people of colour, for the LGBTQ plus community, people with disabilities, like all number of vulnerable groups. Because at best, it leads to population control, it leads to closed borders, it leads to control over women's reproductive rights. And at worst, it leads to prioritising certain lives over others. And that means race-based violence, and that means genocide. Not to be so dark on the sunniest day ever, but, like, we all know historically how this stuff has gone. So we really need to be collectively pushing against that narrative. And basically, we talked about it a lot, and we reckon we're on the cusp of change here. Like, it is so clear to so many people that the old order is failing, right? The cracks that were brutally exposed in 2008 are just getting deeper and wider, and we're at a really pivotal time in history. And we can push it one way or the other, right? We can descend into the chaos of fascism, racism, and environmental breakdown, or we can really take this as an opportunity to heal, right? We can be creating economies and societies that work for everybody, not for the ever-decreasing few. And it's essential that in this point of flux, we as feminists, as right-on people, are pushing in the right direction so that we can create a better future for everyone.
Thank you very much. I really like the phrase that care jobs are green jobs. I think it very much summarizes one of the main points of this talk today and of the paper. So thanks for making it, Maeve. And also, I really like the idea of a rainbow recovery. So one that encapsulates feminist principles, environmental principles, and ensures that we will have an economy that works for everyone and not just a very narrow proportion of the population. So we have roughly 10 minutes for questions. So Jenna has been sending a few over to me. We've been having brilliant questions. Unfortunately, obviously our time is limited, so I'm going to ask a few of the panelists. Starting perhaps with one that we've been getting quite a lot of, which is making sure that when we're talking about a feminist Green New Deal, we're also talking about class and disability, in particular in terms of jobs. So I guess the question is, how do we avoid class dividers in green jobs, and that we create a Green New Deal that speaks for disabled women too? So let's start with this one. Sherilyn, I don't know if you want to start with some comments on this question, and then we can go through Maeve and Halima if you also want to comment on that. So please keep your contribution short so that we have some time for a couple more if possible.
Yeah, I have a hard time speaking briefly about any of these things because, like, as you can tell, Maeve and I are both very enthusiastic about this issue. And I think to preface everything with the comment about intersectionality means that class is absolutely part of the analysis and part of the concern, and the need to make a green recovery or a Green New Deal about working, economic justice and ensuring that all types of work are valued. And I think, again, the danger of a lot of the green narrative is that these are very high skilled jobs in certain industries. Of course, there'll be a lot of people who will be laid off as we close down fossil fuel and extractive industries. and of course unions and people who are involved in thinking about what comes after these industries have to be part of a Green New Deal, and a lot of this work will be in the kinds of similar kinds of areas of building things. But the people who have worked in those sectors, who are mainly men, don't necessarily need to move into more heavy, hard kinds of jobs. Why not retrain into different kinds of work that are different kinds of work that are socially meaningful and necessary? So social care and teaching. Maeve, do you want to add to that? Because you've looked a lot about questions about employment, just really briefly.
Yeah, really briefly, I think that it would sort of redefine the thinking around class, because the idea behind the Green New Deal would be that we publicly provide a lot of these goods and services so that this stuff is accessible to all, and that the quality of life of people on the lowest rung of the ladder is greatly improved. And I think that, as well as when we speak about automation and shorter working weeks, we're really thinking about, rather than focusing our sort of identity around our jobs and that's who we are and that defines how we interact with society and the economy, it's more about, yeah, like we were discussing earlier, about putting the caring stuff, the stuff that makes us human, putting that front and center. So yeah, there would be, in my mind, it would be a much more equal society, which would speak to class a lot, but there would be a lot more interaction between people from different walks of life in these public spaces, these participatory and democratic processes that we're creating, and the rest of it. Yeah.
Halima, do you want to add something to the discussion on basically intersectionality?
Yeah, I would love to, actually. So I think what COVID has shown us is that we're valuing the wrong sorts of professions, and that we need to think about who the real superstars, the superheroes are. So I think, I don't want to think of it as an opportunity, but I want to think of it as a time when we can really actually have a stark reckoning in society about what we value and what we don't value. So care would be a centerpiece of that. So I think with COVID, I think we mustn't sort of just let go of that door opening for us. And I think now's the time to really, really push hard on all the messages that we are discussing here. What I would say about class and intersectionality is this: if we're all in it together, but actually we're leaving out the working classes, we're leaving out BAME groups, we're leaving out marginal women, we can't really be in it together, and they are probably suffering disproportionately. So how do we move away from a movement that feels very membership based, or based on the ability to purchase organic food and so on? We need to start thinking about affordability and how we can locate that movement in estates and communities where people actually think about whether they can bring food on the table or whether they can go organic. And this is why I really love some of the work that the our Women's Environmental Network does, because we actually co-create projects that go into estates and places where people are already congregating out of necessity, not because it's a nice to have. And I think the one problem with our movement, and I'm to blame as much as anybody else, is that it's still a nice to have, and people are generally thinking about food and hunger at the moment. So how do we make sure that the environmental movement is also tackling food hunger and food insecurity and financial stress and so on? That's where you can actually think about a movement that feels more inclusive, where we do feel like we're all in it together.
That's a very good point, Halima, and I think it also segues very well into one other question that kept resurfacing, which was, so basically, how can we put these feminist ideas into practice? So what examples can you suggest to inspire local initiatives? And particularly, Halima, I think WEN has been doing a lot of grassroots work trying to involve local women into these discussions, and with practical initiatives as well. So if you could speak a little bit more about that, and also Sherilyn and Maeve, your contributions on how we could, how could we inspire local initiatives on some of these things that sometimes might feel a bit sort of blue sky thinking at the moment.
Do you want me to go first, or? So this is where I wish my colleagues were with me, because they'd be able to give you a much better picture of the fantastic initiatives that we have on the ground. But what we're seeing now, I mean, when COVID hit, we thought that we might actually have to start rethinking some of our work and repurpose it in a way that perhaps it felt that it wasn't as necessary now. But in fact, because our projects have been curated with food and waste disposal at the heart of what we do, that work is even more integral now with COVID than ever before. So the work around community centers and food growing, bringing in Somali groups who absolutely love growing food the way that they did in their home countries before they came here on the onset of the civil war, or the way British Bangladeshi women like to grow. We've actually started thinking about those projects that keep communities together, and they've been flourishing. So it might be worth looking at some of our projects and how we've created them to try and learn a little bit about it. But food is really the anchor of it all, and food is what's keeping together, I would say, even the mutual aid systems, mutual aid groups that have grown up over the past 3 months, because in themselves, they're not enough really to provide that support that communities need. But if you link up food supplies with mutual aid groups to community centers that are already on the front line, serving BAME communities or other white working class communities that are very vulnerable, then I think you've got a really good ecosystem that starts to feel like a collective push around what that feminist society could look like that Maeve and Sherilyn talked about.
Sherilyn and Maeve, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, just to bang on about community wealth building. Yeah, I think that, so in Preston, they've been trialing community wealth building, this type of local economic development since 2013, and they've done a lot in America as well. And the idea is, yeah, around procurement, and it's working with the local authority, working with big not-for-profit organisations in the area. So, for example, universities or hospitals or the local constabulary in Preston, and working with them on their procurement policies to make sure that they prioritise locally run firms, so locally run caterers or laundry services or what have you. And I think that you can do so much through this model because you can prioritize a lot of other things as well. So different forms of ownership, which I've mentioned quite a few times, is a big part of that. And having cooperative firms, for example, which by their very nature, it's not just a boss at the top telling everybody what to do. It's collaborative, and it's a collaborative process, and people deciding this stuff together and deciding what happens to the profits that they make together. And I think that by doing that, it's not you don't have to wait for the government to say to you, right, Preston, you've got this much money and you can do this. This is stuff that local authorities can be doing now, and it's increases the voices of people within that community and gives them control over how their community is directed. And that, in conjunction, as we say, with the necessary provision to support people from a wide variety of backgrounds to engage in that, I think could go a really long way to on the ground creating this inclusive process that we're talking about, without it having to be this thing that we all decide all of a sudden, right, this is how we do things. We can do it within our own localities through these means, which I think is I'm very excited about it.
Sherilyn, do you have anything to add?
I think, just in interest of time, I won't add anything else to that, but I think that it would be great if we can capture all the comments that people have been making during this event, and because I'm sure there are many, many examples of practice that people could be offering into the project, really, of carrying on this discussion. And I know that that Wen and the Women's Budget Group will be trying to keep progressing and developing on all of these ideas that we've talked about today.
So thank you very much, everyone. I'm conscious we've run out of time. Unfortunately, we had lots of really interesting questions, and in particular, people were really talking about how universal basic income and universal basic services fit into a feminist Green New Deal. Any plans on this? I realize this is really big discussion that we could potentially organize a new webinar just on these topics. Just to mention again to everyone that this will be part of what the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which is due to report in September, is also going to be looking at. So if anyone is interested in this, please do hold on for that. Yes, we hope that, like I mentioned at the very beginning, this is just the first step in the discussions about how a feminist Green New Deal could look like in the UK in particular. And so we hope to be able to do more work on this in the near future and involve everyone here as well. So big thank you to Maeve Cohen, Halima Begum and Sherilyn MacGregor for this fantastic discussion. Thanks everyone for giving up your lunch hour in such a beautiful and sunshiny day. And I hope, yeah, you enjoy the rest of your evenings, and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks for hosting.